Hey, Mike.
Oh, hey, Randy. How's the project going?
We're making some great progress on your t-shirt store. We've added some PHP to make our HTML files easier to maintain. As you know, today we're going to use some advanced functionality with PHP. Forms.
Yeah, I'm excited to learn about the forms. You know, I've been reading some Plato to get ready.
Wait, what are you reading?
You know, Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher? He had this whole theory about forms like beauty, justice, goodness. I learned about him on Wikipedia.
Mike, those aren't the forms you're looking for. We're going to talk about web forms. I'll be walking through how to build out a contact form for your t-shirt store. We'll be building off the code we finished last time. If you don't still have that handy, you can download my copy of it from the previous video. I'll be introducing some new HTML elements for input fields and buttons. I included the CSS to style them back when we started the project. Start up your local web server again and open your browser to the root of it. Navigate to the contact page. Next, open up your text editor to your htdocs directory and open up the contact.php file. We'll be spending some good quality time with this PHP file as we build out our contact form. Let's start off by adding some of the HTML I've defined for our page structure, wrapping the page content in a div with the class of wrapper. After the heading, let's add a paragraph with a short welcome note. Now let's create the fields into which a site visitor can enter some information. We'll start by adding a simple text field, an input element with a type attribute set to text. Let's save the page and take a look at it in the browser. There's now a text field on the page. A site visitor could now type in a value here. Input fields like this belong inside an HTML form element. This is a container element that allows the values from these input fields to be sent to the server when the form is submitted. There are a couple of different methods the browser can use to send data to the server. We'll discuss them a bit more later on, but for this form, we'll set the method attribute to post. We can have multiple fields in a single form. Each field will need a name attribute so that the server can tell them apart. We'll want the person filling out the form to enter their name here, so we'll give this first field a name attribute of name. A site visitor won't be able to see this name attribute, so they won't know what value to type in the field unless we tell them. There's an HTML element for this called label. The label element has a cool attribute that lets you relate the label to a specific input field. Your input field needs an ID attribute for this to work, so let's add an ID of name to our input field. We can now set an attribute called for on the label. Give it the same value as the ID on the input field, name, and the browser will know that this label goes with that input field. Relating these two elements together is important for accessibility. Screen readers convert text on the page to speech, typically for blind users. Without a clear relationship between a label and an input field, it is difficult for someone using a screen reader to know what to put in a particular input field. Even in a visual browser, you can see a nice usability improvement if these two fields are related. If you click on a label, the browser will act as if you'd clicked on the input field. With this input box, for example, clicking on the label places the cursor directly in the related input field. Let's add a few more fields to our form. For forms with multiple fields, it's fairly common to use an HTML table element. You may have heard something about not using tables in your HTML. The key is not to use tables for layout. If you have a 3-column layout, for example, don't use an HTML table for that. But if you do have tabular data, then a table element is perfectly acceptable. For each form field, we'll add a row to the table. Each row will have 2 columns, one column for the label and one column for the field. The cell with the label acts as a heading for the cell with the field. We'll use the table header cell element, th, for the label, and we'll use table data cell, td, element for the cell with the field. To add additional fields to the form, we can add an additional row to this table. This will be a field where the site visitor can enter their email address. Let's change the name and the ID attributes to email. And let's change the label. Let's change the for attribute on the label to match. And change the text that the user sees. Let's paste another row here. This field will be for the message. This input element allows for only one line of text. It's ideal for fields like name and email address, but it won't work for this field like a message. There's a separate HTML element for that, the text area element. The text area element has an opening and a closing tag. If you wanted some text to appear inside the text area by default, you would put it here in between the opening and closing tag. Change the name and the ID attributes of this text area to message. Next, we'll add a button down here below the table. A submit button is another type of input element, this time with a type of submit. You can also specify what text appears on the button by specifying a value attribute. Let's use send. We now have a nice form in place. Visitors to our site can enter information into the form fields and click Send to submit the form to our server. Let's take a look at what happens when someone submits our contact form. They first fill in their information and then click Send. The browser sends off a request to the web server as before, but this time it sends a bit more information along with the request, the values the visitor entered into the form fields. The server then has access to these values when it executes our PHP code. Open up your text editor to the contact.php file where we created this form. When the visitor clicks Send, the browser will send the information from the form to a particular PHP file. We can tell the browser where to send it by specifying an action attribute on the form. Let's set it to the name of a new file we'll create called contact-process.php. Let's now create a file with that name to handle the form submission. Let's put a temporary placeholder message at the top of this file. Let's save both these files and take a look at them in the browser. Fill out the form and click Send. Right now, that page just echoes out our temporary message and sends that down to our browser. The browser sends some variables with the information from our form to our contactprocess.php file. Let me now show you how to access those variables in PHP. PHP has a special variable called _post. When a form with a method of post is submitted to a PHP file, the information from that form will be stored in this _post variable. Let's display everything from that _post variable to the screen. Let me show you a new PHP command, the var dump command, that will display all possible information about a particular variable to the screen. Click back in the browser and click Send on the form again. The details about this variable appear as one long string of text because the browser ignores all the white space and line breaks in the HTML when it displays the page. If you view source on the page, you can see it in a format that is easier to read. You'll notice that _post is an array. We'll talk more about arrays when we look at displaying the full lists of shirts. For now, let me just tell you that the _post array is a variable that somehow contains all the variables from the form. You can see 3 variables here inside the _post array: name, email, and message. Let's load the values from these 3 _post variables into regular PHP variables so that we can work with them. We'll create a variable called name. We'll load the proper value from the _post array into it. You can access one of these _post variables by starting with _post, then an opening square bracket, then a quotation mark, and then the name of the variable, which corresponds to the name attribute of the HTML element. Then we close off the quotation mark and the square bracket and end the statement with a semicolon. We can do the same thing to create an email variable and a message variable. Let's end by displaying the values from these variables on the page. Save the file. In the browser, click back and then click Send again. Our PHP file retrieves the values from the post array, loads them into regular PHP variables, and then displays them to the screen. Right now, our site visitors can submit a form to our PHP file. Our PHP file receives that information and displays it on the page, all 3 fields in a continuous line of text. We'll eventually need to send all this information in the body of an email, so let's modify how it looks a little with some text and some formatting. Open your htdocs directory and the contactprocess.php file. Before we echo out the name here, let's echo out some text to describe the data. I put a space inside the quotation mark there because I want a space between the word name and the value from the variable. We could do the same for the other fields, adding separate echo commands before we echo out a value. However, it is possible to echo out a variable and a string together in one command using what's known as concatenation. To concatenate 2 things is to arrange them together in a chain. Let me show you some examples. The concatenation operator in PHP is a period. You can concatenate 2 static pieces of text together, like this, to echo out ice cream. You can also concatenate 2 variables together, like this. You can mix and match these, also concatenating variables and static pieces of text together. While I'm using the echo command with concatenation here, you can also assign a concatenated string to a variable in this manner. Let's combine these 2 echo statements into one, concatenating the label name and the variable. Let's concatenate labels in front of the other 2 fields also. Save this file and switch back over to the browser. Click the back button and submit the form again. We now have our labels in place. The text is still not that easy to read because it is all on one continuous line, but these labels definitely help. Let's next add some line breaks. The echo statements are already on separate lines, but there's no line break in the text that gets echoed out to the browser. We can add line breaks using an escape sequence. You can't exactly type a line break character in the code here, but you can use a sequence of characters that PHP will interpret as a line break. We can add that sequence at the end here, concatenating it to the name variable. Let's add this sequence after email also. Save these files and switch back to the browser again. Click back and submit the form again. View the source on the page, and you'll be able to see the line breaks. If we wanted line breaks to display in the browser, we would have to use a break tag to achieve that. But since we're going to display this in a plain text email message, we don't need the break tag. What we see when we view the source is what we'll see in the email. There is an HTML element we can use to have the browser display the white space. You wouldn't normally use this in a real web page, but it's helpful when working with PHP code values. It's the pre-formatted text element, or pre-tag. We can wrap this whole block of PHP code in a set of pre-tags to see the white space in the browser. Before we do view it in the browser though, let's change one last thing. When we send out this email, we're going to need the entire body of the email in a single variable. We can't echo out the variables one at a time like we do on this page. Let's create a new variable called email body. We'll set it equal to a blank value to start. Now, instead of echoing out this next line, let's add it to the end of that variable. To do this, we assign the email body variable a value equal to itself plus the text concatenated to the end. We can modify our code to add the email address and the message lines to our email body variable in the same way. With all the text for the email body in one variable, let's go ahead and echo it out to the screen for testing. Let's save this file and go back to the browser. Click the back button again, and submit the form. There, that looks much better. We can see the real value in our PHP variable, line breaks and all, now that the browser is displaying it inside of a pre-tag. We covered a lot of ground there, looking at concatenation and exploring how whitespace gets treated in different places. We now have all the information available in our PHP code to send our email. PHP has a mail function we could use, but it doesn't work with every server configuration. Remember how we had to install software to make our computer process PHP code? Well, it takes additional software to make it send email. I recommend using a third-party library and a separate email server, but we're going to need to learn a little bit more about PHP before we can get that set up. Let's do that a little later on in the project. For now, let's assume we've already sent the email and talk about what to do next. Let's write a comment in the code here as a placeholder. You can write a comment in PHP by typing 2 slashes. Anything after these 2 slashes on this line will be treated by PHP as a comment and ignored. We might say something like this: to do, send email. This will be a placeholder reminding us to come back here and send the email later on. After the email gets sent, we want to display a thank you message to the site visitor who completed the form. It might seem natural to include our header files here and then echo out the thank you message. That does work, but there is one problem with that approach. To explain the problem in full, I'll have to go ahead and build it out this way. Just like our regular pages, let's set our variables for section and page title here. Then, let's include the header. Then let's add the HTML for the page to display this message. Then let's add the HTML structure for the page, just like we have done on other pages. Then we'll add the content of the page with a heading and a paragraph. And then we'll end the file by including the footer. Let me save this file and switch back to the browser. Complete the contact form and click Send. The browser navigates to contact.process.php, and we can see our thank you message here. Like I said, this approach mostly works. Imagine now, though, that a visitor wants to visit more of our site. Maybe they click the home page, but then decide instead to use the back button to go back to where they were. When they click back to our contact.process.php file, the server might send another email. Some browsers will pop up a warning like this one, asking if the user really wants to resubmit the form. Remember when we submitted the form and requested the contact.process.php file originally, we sent our post variables along with that request. The browser now wants to know if we want to submit the form again. If we say yes here, the PHP file will load and send us another email. If we say no, then we'll get an ugly error page. Neither of those are ideal. I suppose it's not too bad if we get duplicate emails, but in other cases, this could be a really big deal. Imagine a form that processes a credit card. No visitor to our site would want to click the back button and then have their credit card charged again. The best way to solve this problem is to have PHP first send the email and then redirect the visitor to a different thank you page. If we do it properly, the post submission will not be recorded as part of the browser's history. Let's create another file for the thank you page. We'll call it contactthanks.php. We can move all the code we wrote to display the thank you message over to the new file. Back in the contactprocess.php file, we can do a redirect after we send the email. The PHP command for this is header. This has nothing to do with our own header include file that displays the logo and the menu. This is part of HTTP, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, that defines how the server and the browser communicate. before any HTML gets passed. The header field we want to define is location, which tells the browser to go look instead for a different page, the new page we just created. Our contact process PHP file will now gather all the variables from the form, eventually send the email, and then redirect to the thank you page. Let's take a look at this in action. When I submit the form, I end up in the browser at contactthanks.php. If I click back, it goes to contact.php, skipping contactprocess.php entirely. We have created 3 PHP files for this process. It works just fine like this, but it's a far more common practice to route all 3 of these activities through a single PHP file. We can use conditionals in that one file to execute the code for each activity in different circumstances. Let's open up contact.php. Right now this file only displays the contact form. Let's modify it to handle the form submission as well, using the code from contactprocess.php. Let's first change this action attribute on the form to contact.php so that the information will get sent to this PHP file. In fact, this is the default behavior if you leave the action parameter blank or omit it altogether. Unless you specify otherwise, the form will automatically submit back to the same page. We now need to set up this file to handle the form submission. We can move the code from contactprocess.php over here. Once we've moved the code, it's safe to delete this file. We now need to write a conditional around this code we just pasted in so that it only executes when form values have been submitted to it. Remember when we set the method attribute on our form to post? On regular requests for a web page, the method is get. But with a submission from our contact form, we have instead specified a method of post. We can check the request method using another special PHP variable called _server. Just like the special _post variable we looked at earlier, _server is an array with multiple elements in it. The element we want to check is called request method. Let's add a conditional that checks the request method. If the request method is post, then we want to execute this block of code. Remember to use the double equal sign here to compare 2 values. The single equal sign is used to assign a value. If the request method is not post, then we'll skip over this code block, and the contact form will be displayed like normal. But if the request method is post, we'll read the information from the submitted form, we'll send an email, and then we'll set the HTTP header that will redirect the browser to the thank you page. One last thing we need to add here. After we set the header, it's a good practice to use PHP's exit command. This immediately stops any more of the PHP code in the file from running, and the browser will redirect to the thank you page. After our code sends the email, it uses an HTTP header to redirect to the thank you page. Right now, that's at contactthanks.php. We need instead to direct back to this page itself, contact.php, but we need somehow to let the server know to display the thank you message instead of the form. We can accomplish that by adding a string at the end of the web address. After the file name, type a question mark and a variable with any name. Let's call it status. We'll use an equal sign and then specify a value of thanks. Variables added to the web address in this manner get sent to the server along with the request for the web page. They are available in a special PHP variable called _get. This variable works just like the _post and _server variables we've already looked at. The element we want to check here is status, the same name we gave it in the web address. We can use this value in a conditional to check whether we should show the form or the thank you message. Scroll down past the code that gets executed when the request method is post. The page variables are set, the header is included, and the headline is displayed. We can leave all that the same whether we show the form or the thank you message. But below that, the code will be different. We can write a conditional here that checks the value of the get variable status. If it has a value of thanks, then we'll display our message from contactthanks.php. That's all we need from that other file, so we can go ahead and remove that. When we show the thank you message, we don't need to show the form. We only need to show one or the other, not both. To accomplish this, we can add an else statement to our conditional. If the check in our conditional is true, then it executes the code in the if block. If it's not true, then it executes the code in the else block. Let's put our form in the else block for this conditional. Let's indent our code to make it a little easier to see that it's inside the else block. We end the else block with a closing curly bracket. Let's scroll back up and review. Our code checks if the status variable has a value of thanks, and if so, it outputs this thank you message. Otherwise, it executes this block of code that displays the form. One last thing we should do in this conditional. We're currently checking the value of the get variable's status here. But if that variable doesn't exist at all, then this conditional would generate a notice that might be visible in the browser. We should first check whether or not the variable exists using PHP's isSet function. This conditional will first check if getStatus exists, and then it will check if it has a value of thanks. Let's take a look at the whole process in the browser. Visiting contact.php still displays the form. I'll fill out the form and click Send. When I do that, the form posts to contact.php, which processes the information from the form and then redirects to contact.php with a get variable added. With this variable in place, the page displays the thank you message instead of the form. We still need to send the email, which we'll do a little later on. But we have everything else in place to handle information submitted through our contact form.